At the town's spring fair, laughter and music filled the air, except for the moment it turned cruel. In the middle of the crowd stood a little girl, 7 years old, wearing a crooked paper crown she'd made with her last $5. Older kids snatched it from her head and tossed it around like garbage. She whispered, "It's real to me," fighting tears. When a billionaire in a tailored suit stopped, took the crown, and placed it back on her head. Then, before everyone, he bowed. What happened next would change all their lives forever. The spring fair was supposed to be the highlight of the year in the small town. Colorful tents lined the streets. Vendors shouted about their candied apples. Balloons floated above children's heads, and laughter carried on the breeze. It was the kind of day that looked perfect on postcards, except for the little girl standing in the middle of the crowd clutching a paper crown. Her crown was jagged, unevenly cut with safety scissors, and covered in smudged crayon lines. She wore it proudly, though, her chin held high, even as a group of older kids pointed at her and burst into laughter. "Nice crown, Princess," one of them mocked. "Where's your castle? Made out of cardboard boxes?" The little girl's cheeks burned, but she didn't cry. She just pressed the crown tighter on her head and whispered, "It's real to me." Her name was Sophie, 7 years old, dressed in a hand-me-down yellow dress that was a size too big. Her shoes were scuffed, her braids slightly uneven, but there was something about the way she stood, determined, unyielding, that didn't match her small frame. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts at a diner across town and had given Sophie $5 that morning with a kiss on the forehead. "Make today magical, baby," she had said, though her tired eyes betrayed the weight of bills waiting at home. Sophie had taken that $5, bought colored paper from the craft stall, and sat at a picnic table cutting and coloring until her fingers cramped. By the time the fair was in full swing, she had created her crown. To her it wasn't paper, it was gold, shining, with jewels only she could see. But to the other children, it was nothing but trash. When one boy reached forward and yanked it off her head, Sophie lunged after him, panic in her chest. "Give it back," she cried. But he tossed it to another child, and the paper crown was passed around like a cruel joke. Each time she reached for it, the laughter grew louder. That was when a tall man in a tailored navy suit walked by. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect at a small-town fair. His polished shoes avoided the sticky patches of spilled soda on the ground. His tie was perfectly knotted, his dark hair swept back with precision. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom in New York City, not surrounded by booths selling cotton candy and face paint. His name was Daniel Mercer, 42 years old, CEO of Mercer Holdings, a company worth billions. Most people only saw him on magazine covers or news interviews, where he spoke in a calm, commanding voice about investments and innovation. In person, he radiated the kind of quiet power that made people instinctively move out of his way. He hadn't come to the fair for fun. He had grown up in this town, left at 18 on a scholarship and never looked back. But when the mayor invited him as a guest of honor to cut the ribbon for the fair's new business development wing, Daniel had agreed out of a sense of obligation. The town had raised him, even if it never felt like home. He had told himself he would stay only an hour, but then he saw Sophie. The moment caught him off guard. Amid the sea of colors, sounds, and faces, he saw a little girl reaching desperately for her crumpled paper crown as other children laughed. Something about her small frame, her stubborn refusal to give up, struck him like a memory he had long buried. He saw himself at her age, standing in second-hand shoes, mocked for carrying a lunch in a grocery bag instead of a shiny box like the other kids. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible, powerless. Daniel's steps slowed. He should have kept walking. This wasn't his business. But his feet moved before his mind caught up. "What's going on here?" His voice cut through the laughter like a blade. The children froze. The boy holding the crown looked up at Daniel, startled. "We were just bullying," Daniel finished for him, his tone flat, authoritative. He held out his hand. "Give it to me." The boy hesitated, then reluctantly placed the crumpled crown into Daniel's palm. Daniel carefully straightened it, smoothing the bent edges with surprising gentleness. Then he crouched down until he was eye-level with Sophie. "Is this yours?" he asked softly. Sophie's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Yes," she whispered. He studied her face, the defiance trembling under hurt, the pride fighting against humiliation. And then, in front of everyone watching, Daniel Mercer did something no one expected. He placed the paper crown back on Sophie's head, and then he bowed. A full, graceful bow from the waist, the kind of gesture one might give a queen. The crowd gasped. Whispers rippled through the fairgrounds. The older kids who had mocked her stared wide-eyed, their smirks wiped clean. Sophie's lips parted, stunned. "Every kingdom needs a queen," Daniel said solemnly, "and today, I think that's you." For the first time that day, Sophie smiled. What Daniel didn't realize was that this single moment would change not just Sophie's life, but his own. The fair didn't return to normal after that moment. Whispers followed Daniel wherever he walked. Parents craned their necks to see the Millionaire CEO bowing to a little girl in a paper crown. And children who had been laughing seconds earlier now avoided Sophie's gaze as though she really did wear gold and diamonds on her head. But Sophie didn't care about them anymore. She stood taller, her small hands resting against the edges of her crown as though to protect it. And for the first time she believed it truly was something magical. Daniel lingered longer than he meant to. He had planned to cut the ribbon, shake the mayor's hand, and leave for his next meeting. Instead, he found himself trailing behind Sophie and her mother, Maria, as they wandered through the fair. Maria walked with a tired gait, her diner uniform covered by a plain cardigan, her eyes focused on making $5 stretch into a day her daughter would remember. Daniel noticed the way she carefully steered Sophie toward the free attractions, the petting zoo, the clown show, the music stage, while avoiding the booths that charged tickets. At one point, Sophie spotted the carousel, its horses spinning under strings of lights. She ran forward, tugging her mother's sleeve. "Please, Mama, just once?" Maria's face tightened. She searched her purse, counted the coins, and shook her head. "Not today, baby. Maybe next time." Sophie's shoulders slumped, but she didn't argue. She just adjusted her paper crown and said quietly, "It's okay. Queens don't need carousels." Something inside Daniel cracked. He had built his empire on control, on never letting emotions dictate his actions, but this small girl and her paper crown had undone him completely. Without a word, he stepped forward, handed the ride operator a crisp $100 bill, and said, "Every child in line rides free for the next half hour." Gasps erupted from the parents nearby. Children squealed with delight. The operator's eyes widened, but he nodded quickly. Maria turned, stunned. "Sir, you don't have to—" "I know," Daniel interrupted gently. His eyes softened as he looked at Sophie. "But sometimes queens deserve to ride." When Sophie climbed onto the painted horse, her crown slightly askew, her laughter filled the air like bells. Daniel stood by the fence, watching, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, yes, but also longing. Because for all his billions, Daniel Mercer had no children, no family waiting at home, no small voice calling him Daddy. His penthouse was silent when he returned each night, and his empire, as vast as it was, felt hollow compared to the sound of one little girl laughing on a carousel. Maria noticed the look on his face, the way he watched her daughter not like a man flaunting wealth, but like someone remembering what it meant to hope. She approached him cautiously. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel hesitated. He could have said it was nothing, that he was just being generous. But the truth slipped out instead. "Because someone once laughed at me for having less. And I swore if I ever had more, I'd never let a child feel that small again." Maria blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. For the first time she saw not the CEO on magazine covers, but a man, one who carried his own old wounds beneath his polished suit. When the carousel slowed and Sophie hopped off, she ran straight to Daniel, not her mother. She looked up at him with her big brown eyes, her crown slipping sideways. "Did you see me?" she asked breathlessly. Daniel crouched again, adjusting the paper crown on her head. "I saw you," he said softly. "You were perfect." And in that moment, without planning it, Daniel Mercer knew this day was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. That evening, after the fair ended, Daniel found himself sitting in his black town car parked outside the diner where Maria worked the night shift. He told his driver to wait. He didn't know why he was there. All he knew was that after the carousel, after watching Sophie fall asleep against her mother's shoulder with the paper crown still on her head, he couldn't just walk away. Through the fogged glass windows, he saw Maria balancing 3 trays at once, moving between booths with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed, casting harsh shadows on the walls, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. He noticed how she leaned down to speak kindly to an elderly couple, how she joked with a tired trucker, how she never faltered, even when a customer barked at her about cold coffee. It was nearly midnight when she stepped outside, tugging her sweater around her shoulders. The paper crown was tucked safely under her arm. Sophie had insisted her mother keep it safe while she slept. Daniel stepped out of the car. She startled. "Mr. Mercer, what are you—" "Daniel," he corrected gently. "Please, just Daniel." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why are you here?" He hesitated, then said the truth. "Because I can't stop thinking about your daughter." Maria stiffened, protective instinct flashing across her face. "She's just a child." "I know," Daniel said quickly. "That's why. She reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago." His voice softened. "What it is like to believe in something small, to wear a paper crown and mean it." Maria studied him for a long moment. She had met plenty of men, some kind, some cruel, some who looked at her with pity, and others who looked at her like an opportunity. Daniel wasn't like any of them. There was no pity in his eyes, no arrogance either, just honesty. Still, she crossed her arms. "I appreciate what you did today, but Sophie doesn't need a hero who shows up once and disappears. She needs stability, consistency, things I work hard to give her, even if it's not much." Daniel nodded. Her words cut deeper than she knew, because consistency was the one thing his own childhood had lacked. He thought of his mother, working late nights at a laundromat, of the empty fridge, of the eviction notices. He had sworn as a teenager that he would never live like that again, and he hadn't. But he had also never given himself permission to look back, until now. "Then let me help," he said quietly. Maria shook her head. "Help usually comes with strings." "Not from me," he promised. She didn't answer right away, but when Sophie stirred in her sleep, murmuring about her crown, Maria's expression softened. She looked down at her daughter, then back at Daniel. "She likes you," she admitted reluctantly. Daniel felt something unexplainable move in his chest. "I like her too." It was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet, but both felt. The next morning, Daniel was in his office, the top floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking the city skyline. His assistants buzzed around, phones rang, screens glowed with numbers climbing into billions. But for once, he wasn't thinking about stocks or contracts. He was thinking about a paper crown, about a little girl who had held it like treasure, about her mother's wary eyes. When his assistant reminded him of his lunch with investors, he waved it off. "Reschedule." "Sir, it's the Hudson Group," she protested. "I said reschedule." Because Daniel Mercer had decided something. Money could wait. Sophie couldn't. The next morning, Daniel was in his office, the top floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking the city skyline. His assistants buzzed around, phones rang, screens glowed with numbers climbing into billions. But for once, he wasn't thinking about stocks or contracts. He was thinking about a paper crown, about a little girl who had held it like treasure, about her mother's wary eyes. When his assistant reminded him of his lunch with investors, he waved it off. Reschedule? Sir, it's the Hudson Group, she protested. I said reschedule, because Daniel Mercer had decided something. Money could wait. Sophie couldn't. That afternoon, instead of heading to another meeting, Daniel drove back to the diner. Maria was wiping down a booth when he walked in, her hair tied back, her face flushed from hours of work. She froze when she saw him, her hand tightening on the cloth. You again? She said cautiously. Daniel slid into the booth. Me again. You don't belong here, she said quietly. You stick out like a diamond in a toolbox. Daniel's lips curved faintly. I grew up here. Maybe I belong more than you think. That caught her off guard. She set the cloth aside, her brows knitting. You? From this town? He nodded once. Other side of the tracks. Tiny apartment over a laundromat. My mom used to walk these same streets with holes in her shoes. I left when I was 18 and never thought I'd look back. He paused. Until yesterday. Maria sank into the seat across from him, despite herself. Something about the way he said it, with no trace of arrogance, only honesty, made her believe him. Why are you really here, Daniel? She asked. He met her gaze steadily. Because your daughter reminded me of something I lost, and because you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders alone. You don't have to. Maria let out a short laugh, bitter but tired. That's easy for a man with billions to say. I don't get to walk away from bills. I don't get to delegate raising my daughter. She leaned forward. I don't want charity. Daniel shook his head. This isn't charity. This is responsibility. I have more than I could ever spend in 10 lifetimes, and yet I've done nothing that mattered as much as putting a paper crown back on your daughter's head. Maria stared at him for a long moment, speechless. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the kind of sincerity that wasn't rehearsed for cameras or crafted for investors. Finally, she said softly, if you want to be in Sophie's life, you have to prove you'll stay. She's had enough people. Walk away. Daniel nodded once, solemnly. Then I'll stay. And from that day forward, he did. Daniel kept his word. He started small, showing up at the diner once or twice a week, always sitting in the same booth, always ordering the same simple meal. At first, Maria thought it was curiosity that brought him back, a novelty for a man who lived in a world of glass towers and private jets. But weeks passed, and he kept coming. Sometimes he read while she worked, other times he simply watched the rhythm of the place, greeting the regulars like he wasn't a billionaire, but just another man grabbing dinner after a long day. The other waitresses whispered about him, puzzled at why someone like him would linger in a greasy spoon. Maria pretended not to care, but she noticed the way Sophie lit up whenever he appeared. One evening, Sophie marched up to his booth with a notebook in her hand. Do you know how to do math? She asked seriously. Daniel smiled faintly. I manage a company worth billions. I know a little. She slid the notebook toward him, her homework filled with crooked numbers and smudged eraser marks. I don't get this problem. Can you help? Daniel pulled the pencil from behind her ear and explained it step by step, his voice patient. Sophie listened intently, her little brow furrowed until her face broke into a grin when she got the answer right. She hugged the notebook to her chest. You're really smart, she declared. For the first time in years, Daniel felt pride that had nothing to do with boardrooms or quarterly reports. Maria watched from the counter, her chest tightening. It scared her how quickly Sophie had grown attached, how easily Daniel seemed to slip into their lives. But when she saw the tenderness in his eyes as he helped her daughter, she couldn't bring herself to push him away. As weeks turned into months, Daniel became a fixture. He showed up at school recitals, sitting in the back row in his tailored suit while Sophie scanned the crowd until she spotted him. He brought paper and crayons instead of expensive toys, telling her every queen needed to design her kingdom. He never flaunted his wealth. He just gave them his presence, something Maria realized mattered more than any check ever could. But not everyone approved. One afternoon, as Sophie played in the schoolyard with her paper crown still proudly perched on her head, two mothers whispered loudly enough for Maria to hear. "That's the girl the millionaire's been spoiling. Can you imagine? He'll get bored and leave, and then what?" The words sliced through Maria like knives. That night she confronted Daniel. "People are talking. They think you're playing some game, that you'll disappear when you get tired of us." Daniel listened in silence. Then he stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Maria, I've spent half my life building walls so no one could touch me. I didn't expect your daughter to walk straight through them with a paper crown. I don't want out. I want in. And if it takes the rest of my life to prove it, I will." For the first time, Maria believed him. It wasn't wealth that made her trust him. It was the way Sophie's laughter grew freer with him around, the way he never treated them like charity, the way he looked at her not as a burden, but as an equal. Slowly, cautiously, Maria let herself hope. And Daniel, the man who once measured his worth by numbers on a screen, began to measure it by smaller things, helping with homework, walking Sophie to school, standing at Maria's side as though he had always belonged there. He had bowed to a little girl with a paper crown, and in doing so, he had found his queen. Weeks later, the whispers in town grew louder. People loved to talk when something didn't fit their picture of normal, and a billionaire spending his evenings in a small-town diner with a waitress and her daughter was anything but ordinary. Some whispered with awe, others with suspicion, and a few with cruelty. Maria tried to ignore it, but the looks followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, at church, even at Sophie's school. It came to a head one Friday afternoon when Sophie came home in tears, the paper crown torn in half. Maria rushed to her side, pulling her close. "What happened, baby?" "They said I'm not a real princess," Sophie sobbed. "They said he's only here because he feels sorry for us. They said he'll leave." Maria's heart broke. She wanted to promise her daughter that none of it was true, but the fear inside her whispered the same doubts late at night when she was alone. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Daniel stood there, holding takeout bags, his tie loosened, his expression softening the moment he saw Sophie's tear-streaked face. He set the food down and crouched in front of her. "Who hurt you?" Sophie sniffled, clutching the torn crown. "The kids at school, they laughed at me." Daniel took the crown gently from her hands. "Do you know what makes a queen?" She shook her head. "Not gold, not castles. A queen is someone who stands tall even when people try to push her down, someone who doesn't let others decide her worth." "And Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "that's you?" Then, right there on the living room floor, he pieced the crown back together with tape, smoothing the edges until it sat proudly on her head once more. "Every queen needs a crown," he said, "even if it's made of paper and tape." Sophie's smile returned through her tears, and she threw her arms around his neck. Maria stood in the doorway watching, her chest aching. She had spent years fighting alone to protect her daughter from the world's cruelty, and here was this man, this stranger, who had become something more, fighting beside them without being asked. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with Daniel. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. Finally, she whispered, "What if they're right? What if one day you wake up and realize we don't fit into your world?" Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "Maria, I've lived in my world for a long time. The money, the power, the endless meetings, it all feels hollow compared to this kitchen, this table, this family. I don't want to leave. I want to belong here." The vulnerability in his voice left no room for doubt. Maria looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire the world admired, but the boy he had once been, the boy who had known hunger and ridicule, the boy who had sworn he would never let a child feel small again. And for the first time she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. Weeks later, the whispers in town grew louder. People loved to talk when something didn't fit their picture of normal, and a billionaire spending his evenings in a small-town diner with a waitress and her daughter was anything but ordinary. Some whispered with awe, others with suspicion, and a few with cruelty. Maria tried to ignore it, but the looks followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, at church, even at Sophie's school. It came to a head one Friday afternoon when Sophie came home in tears, the paper crown torn in half. Maria rushed to her side, pulling her close. "What happened, baby?" "They said I'm not a real princess," Sophie sobbed. "They said he's only here because he feels sorry for us. They said he'll leave." Maria's heart broke. She wanted to promise her daughter that none of it was true, but the fear inside her whispered the same doubts late at night when she was alone. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Daniel stood there, holding take-out bags, his tie loosened, his expression softening the moment he saw Sophie's tear-streaked face. He set the food down and crouched in front of her. "Who hurt you?" Sophie sniffled, clutching the torn crown. "The kids at school. They laughed at me." Daniel took the crown gently from her hands. "Do you know what makes a queen?" She shook her head. "Not gold, not castles. A queen is someone who stands tall, even when people try to push her down. Someone who doesn't let others decide her worth. And Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "that's you." Then, right there on the living room floor, he pieced the crown back together with tape, smoothing the edges until it sat proudly on her head once more. "Every queen needs a crown," he said, "even if it's made of paper and tape." Sophie's smile returned through her tears, and she threw her arms around his neck. Maria stood in the doorway watching, her chest aching. She had spent years fighting alone to protect her daughter from the world's cruelty, and here was this man, this stranger, who had become something more, fighting beside them without being asked. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with Daniel. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. Finally she whispered, "What if they're right? What if one day you wake up and realize we don't fit into your world?" Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "Maria, I've lived in my world for a long time. The money, the power, the endless meetings, it all feels hollow compared to this kitchen, this table, this family. I don't want to leave. I want to belong here." The vulnerability in his voice left no room for doubt. Maria looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire the world admired, but the boy he had once been, the boy who had known hunger and ridicule, the boy who had sworn he would never let a child feel small again. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. Weeks later, the whispers in town grew louder. People loved to talk when something didn't fit their picture of normal. And a billionaire spending his evenings in a small-town diner with a waitress and her daughter was anything but ordinary. Some whispered with awe, others with suspicion, and a few with cruelty. Maria tried to ignore it, but the looks followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, at church, even at Sophie's school. It came to a head one Friday afternoon when Sophie came home in tears, the paper crown torn in half. Maria rushed to her side, pulling her close. "What happened, baby?" "They said I'm not a real princess," Sophie sobbed. "They said he's only here because he feels sorry for us. They said he'll leave." Maria's heart broke. She wanted to promise her daughter that none of it was true, but the fear inside her whispered the same doubts late at night when she was alone. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Daniel stood there holding take-out bags, his tie loosened, his expression softening the moment he saw Sophie's tear-streaked face. He set the food down and crouched in front of her. Who hurt you? Sophie sniffled, clutching the torn crown. The kids at school, they laughed at me. Daniel took the crown gently from her hands. Do you know what makes a queen? She shook her head. Not gold, not castles. A queen is someone who stands tall even when people try to push her down. Someone who doesn't let others decide her worth. And Sophie, he said, his voice steady, that's you. Then, right there on the living room floor, he pieced the crown back together with tape, smoothing the edges until it sat proudly on her head once more. Every queen needs a crown, he said, even if it's made of paper and tape. Sophie's smile returned through her tears, and she threw her arms around his neck. Maria stood in the doorway watching, her chest aching. She had spent years fighting alone to protect her daughter from the world's cruelty, and here was this man, this stranger who had become something more, fighting beside them without being asked. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with Daniel. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. Finally she whispered, "What if they're right? What if one day you wake up and realize we don't fit into your world?" Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "Maria, I've lived in my world for a long time. The money, the power, the endless meetings, it all feels hollow compared to this kitchen, this table, this family. I don't want to leave. I want to belong here." The vulnerability in his voice left no room for doubt. Maria looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire the world admired, but the boy he had once been, the boy who had known hunger and ridicule, the boy who had sworn he would never let a child feel small again. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. The diner was busier than usual that night, a Friday crowd filling every booth and bar stool. Maria moved quickly between tables, refilling coffee, balancing plates stacked with burgers and fries, her body aching, but her smile steady. She was used to the rush, used to the tired feet and the aching back, used to swallowing pride when customers snapped at her. But tonight was different, because Daniel was there. He sat quietly in his usual booth near the window, jacket draped neatly over the backrest, eyes following her with quiet focus. It wasn't pity in his gaze, it wasn't amusement, it was respect. And somehow that made her feel lighter, even as the hours dragged on. But not everyone saw it that way. At the counter sat Richard Hale, the town's self-appointed big shot. He owned a string of car dealerships and liked everyone to know it. For years he had lorded his money over others, cutting deals in smoky back rooms and laughing too loud at his own jokes. He'd noticed Daniel at the diner before, but tonight, emboldened by a few too many whiskeys, he decided to make a show of it. "Funny, isn't it?" Richard said, loudly enough for half the diner to hear. "The great Daniel Mercer, billionaire, sitting in a greasy spoon like the rest of us. What's the matter, Mercer? Boardroom's not shiny enough anymore?" His laughter was sharp, ugly. Heads turned. Maria froze mid-step, her tray trembling in her hands. Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back on his stool, smirking at her. "And Maria, looks like you finally landed yourself a big fish. Guess pouring coffee pays off after all, huh? Though I can't imagine what a man like him sees in a woman serving fries for tips." The words hit Maria like a slap. Her cheeks burned, her heart pounding. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the floor, to shield Sophie from hearing any of it. The diner went silent, all eyes flicking between Richard's smug grin and Maria's stricken face. Then Daniel stood. The scrape of his chair against the tiled floor was the only sound in the room. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing in front of Richard Hale. His height, his composure, the quiet power in his movements made the air shift. Richard's smirk faltered, but he tried to recover, puffing out his chest. "What? Can't take a joke?" Daniel's voice was calm, steady, but it carried through the diner like steel. "A joke is supposed to make people laugh, Hale. I don't hear anyone laughing." Whispers rippled through the room. Richard shifted uncomfortably, But Daniel wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his tone low but unmistakably firm. You measure your worth in cars and cheap bravado. She measures hers in sacrifice, working double shifts, raising a daughter on her own, never once asking for a handout. Tell me, which of you really has something to be proud of? Silence. Every patron in the diner stared, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. Maria stood frozen, her throat tight, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but the confidence had drained from him. He mumbled something under his breath, threw a crumpled bill on the counter, and stumbled out into the night. Daniel turned then, meeting Maria's eyes. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was in the way he stood beside her, unflinching, unashamed. For the first time in years, Maria didn't feel small. She felt seen. Sophie peeked from behind the kitchen door, where she had been coloring while her mother worked. She ran straight into Daniel's arms, her paper crown sliding down her hair. Daniel caught her easily, setting her on his hip as if she belonged there. And in that moment the whispers, the stares, the doubts, all of it fell away. Because the millionaire had bowed once to a little girl in a paper crown, and tonight he had bowed again, not with his body, but with his heart. After that night, the atmosphere in the diner changed. People who once whispered behind Maria's back now greeted her with quiet respect. Regular customers who had smirked when Daniel first started showing up began tipping more generously, holding doors open, even offering to help with small chores around the diner. No one said it outright, but the town had seen something in Daniel's defense of her that shifted their perspective. He hadn't spoken as a billionaire lording power over others. He had spoken like a man who valued her worth. For Maria, it was unsettling and comforting all at once. She had grown used to invisibility, used to shouldering her burdens alone. Having someone stand beside her, especially someone like Daniel, felt like learning how to breathe again after years of holding it in. She wanted to resist it, to push him away for her own protection, but every time she looked at Sophie, she knew resistance was pointless. Her daughter adored him. Sophie's paper crown became a symbol in town. At school, children who once teased her began asking if they could make their own. Soon the classroom was filled with crowns of colored paper and tape, a quiet rebellion against cruelty. Teachers smiled when they saw it. Parents shook their heads but couldn't help but admire the way one little girl's courage had turned into something larger. Daniel noticed all of it, but what mattered most to him was Sophie herself. He started helping her with school projects, attending parent-teacher nights when Maria's shift kept her late, sitting in the audience of every recital. He wasn't just present. He was consistent. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Maria found him sitting on the porch with the paper crown in his hands. He looked at it like it was made of diamonds. "You know," he said quietly, "I've signed contracts worth billions, but this is the most valuable thing I've ever held." Maria sat beside him, the night air cool around them. "It's just paper," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "It's a reminder. That strength doesn't come from wealth. It comes from believing you're worthy, even when the world laughs." He turned to her then, his eyes steady. "You taught her that. You gave her that crown long before I put it on her head." Maria's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that, as though she was more than just a waitress, more than just a tired mother fighting to survive. For years she had convinced herself she didn't need anyone to see her, but sitting there beside him, she realized how much she had longed for it. And for the first time since her husband had walked out years before, Maria allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel so lonely. Daniel, the man who had built walls of steel and glass around his life, found himself dismantling them piece by piece, and all because of a little girl who wore a paper crown. As spring turned to summer, Daniel's presence in Maria and Sophie's life became as natural as breathing. He no longer arrived like a guest, but like someone who belonged, someone expected. Sophie would just run to the window when she heard the sound of his car, crown bouncing on her head as she shouted, "He's here!" Maria pretended to scold her for making a fuss, but inside her heart ached with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Daniel had started carving out time from his empire for them. Meetings were delegated, flights postponed. His assistant, long used to his ruthless efficiency, blinked in disbelief when he canceled a deal worth millions just to attend Sophie's school play. He sat in the front row, hands folded, watching her stumble over her lines and beam proudly when she finished. When the applause filled the auditorium, Sophie's eyes searched for his, and the way her face lit up when she found him made him feel richer than any number ever had. Still, shadows lingered. Maria struggled with doubt, with the fear that this was temporary, that one day he would return fully to his world of glass towers and never look back. She kept reminding herself not to rely on him, not to trust too deeply, but trust grew in spite of her defenses. She saw it in the way he never spoke down to her, never treated her as a project to fix, never offered money like a bandage. Instead, he showed up in smaller, deeper ways, helping with Sophie's homework, fixing the leaky faucet in her kitchen without a word, carrying heavy boxes when her back ached. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them went to the park. Sophie insisted on bringing her crown, now patched with more tape than paper, but still her treasure. Children swarmed around the swings and slides. Parents chatted on benches. As Sophie ran off to play, a few parents whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Daniel. Maria braced herself for the sting of judgment, but Daniel leaned closer to her, his voice calm. "Let them talk. People always will. What matters is what Sophie sees and what I see." Maria turned her head, startled. "And what do you see?" He looked at her with a steadiness that left her breathless. "I see a woman who raised a daughter with enough courage to wear a crown the world mocked. I see strength. I see someone I don't want to lose." The words hung between them heavy with meaning. Maria's chest tightened, her carefully guarded walls cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to reply, to tell him that he had already become a part of their lives in ways she couldn't undo, but before she could, Sophie came running back, arms outstretched. Daniel scooped her up easily, crown tilting, her laughter echoing through the park. And in that moment, watching him carry her daughter as though she were the most precious thing in the world, Maria realized something she had been too afraid to admit. Daniel Mercer wasn't just visiting their lives, he was building a home in them. As spring turned to summer, Daniel's presence in Maria and Sophie's life became as natural as breathing. He no longer arrived like a guest, but like someone who belonged, someone expected. Sophie would run to the window when she heard the sound of his car, crown bouncing on her head as she shouted, "He's here!" Maria pretended to scold her for making a fuss, but inside her heart ached with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Daniel had started carving out time from his empire for them. Meetings were delegated, flights postponed. His assistant, long used to his ruthless efficiency, blinked in disbelief when he canceled a deal worth millions just to attend Sophie's school play. He sat in the front row, hands folded, watching her stumble over her lines and beam proudly when she finished. When the applause filled the auditorium, Sophie's eyes searched for his, and the way her face lit up when she found him made him feel richer than any number ever had. Still, shadows lingered. Maria struggled with doubt, with the fear that this was temporary, that one day he would return fully to his world of glass towers and never look back. She kept reminding herself not to rely on him, not to trust too deeply. But trust grew in spite of her defenses. She saw it in the way he never spoke down to her, never treated her as a project to fix, never offered money like a bandage. Instead, he showed up in smaller, deeper ways, helping with Sophie's homework, fixing the leaky faucet in her kitchen without a word, carrying heavy boxes when her back ached. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them went to the park. Sophie insisted on bringing her crown, now patched with more tape than paper, but still her treasure. Children swarmed around the swings and slides, parents chatted on benches. As Sophie ran off to play, a few parents whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Daniel. Maria braced herself for the sting of judgment, but Daniel leaned closer to her, his voice calm. "Let them talk. People always will. What matters is what Sophie sees and what I see." Maria turned her head, startled. "And what do you see?" He looked at her with a steadiness that left her breathless. "I see a woman who raised a daughter with enough courage to wear a crown the world mocked. I see strength. I see someone I don't want to lose." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Maria's chest tightened, her carefully guarded walls cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to reply, to tell him that he had already become a part of their lives in ways she couldn't undo, but before she could, Sophie came running back, arms outstretched. Daniel scooped her up easily, crown tilting, her laughter echoing through the park. And in that moment, watching him carry her daughter as though she were the most precious thing in the world, Maria realized something she had been too afraid to admit. Daniel Mercer wasn't just visiting their lives, he was building a home in them. As spring turned to summer, Daniel's presence in Maria and Sophie's life became as natural as breathing. He no longer arrived like a guest, but like someone who belonged, someone expected. Sophie would run to the window when she heard the sound of his car, crown bouncing on her head as she shouted, "He's here!" Maria pretended to scold her for making a fuss, but inside, her heart ached with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Daniel had started carving out time from his empire for them. Meetings were delegated, flights postponed. His assistant, long used to his ruthless efficiency, blinked in disbelief when he canceled a deal worth millions just to attend Sophie's school play. He sat in the front row, hands folded, watching her stumble over her lines and beam proudly when she finished. When the applause filled the auditorium, Sophie's eyes searched for his, and the way her face lit up when she found him made him feel richer than any number ever had. Still, shadows lingered. Maria struggled with doubt, with the fear that this was temporary, that one day he would return fully to his world of glass towers and never look back. She kept reminding herself not to rely on him, not to trust too deeply, but trust grew in spite of her defenses. She saw it in the way he never spoke down to her, never treated her as a project to fix, never offered money like a bandage. Instead, he showed up in smaller, deeper ways, helping with Sophie's homework, fixing the leaky faucet in her kitchen without a word, carrying heavy boxes when her back ached. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them went to the park. Sophie insisted on bringing her crown, now patched with more tape than paper, but still her treasure. Children swarmed around the swings and slides. Parents chatted on benches. As Sophie ran off to play, a few parents whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Daniel. Maria braced herself for the sting of judgment, but Daniel leaned closer to her, his voice calm. "Let them talk. People always will. What matters is what Sophie sees and what I see." Maria turned her head, startled. "And what do you see?" He looked at her with a steadiness that left her breathless. "I see a woman who raised a daughter with enough courage to wear a crown the world mocked. I see strength. I see someone I don't want to lose." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Maria's chest tightened, her carefully guarded walls cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to reply, to tell him that he had already become a part of their lives in ways she couldn't undo. But before she could, Sophie came running back, arms outstretched. Daniel scooped her up easily, crown tilting, her laughter echoing through the park. And in that moment, watching him carry her daughter as though she were the most precious thing in the world, Maria realized something she had been too afraid to admit. Daniel Mercer wasn't just visiting their lives, he was building a home in them. The change in Daniel was impossible to ignore. For years, his life had been defined by efficiency and results, every decision measured in profit margins and percentages. But now he found himself lingering in the small things, helping Maria cook dinner in her cramped kitchen, listening to Sophie chatter about her day, sitting on the porch long after sunset just to hear the quiet. His board of directors noticed his distraction. "You're losing focus," one executive warned during a tense meeting. Daniel only smiled faintly. "No," he replied, "I'm finding it." Still, not everyone welcomed his shift. At a charity gala in the city, an event where Daniel was expected to network with investors and politicians, whispers followed him again. People noticed Maria on his arm, her simple navy dress standing out among sequined gowns. She held her head high, but Daniel saw the tightness in her smile, the way she felt the weight of every critical glance. Halfway through the evening, a sleekly dressed woman approached, one of Daniel's longtime business acquaintances. She smiled thinly at Maria before turning to him. "Daniel, I must admit I didn't expect to see you with such company." The implication was sharp, designed to humiliate. Maria's chest burned with shame. She started to excuse herself, but Daniel's hand closed firmly over hers. His voice was calm but carried through the ballroom. "You're right. You didn't expect it, because you still measure worth by bank accounts and bloodlines. I don't. This woman," he looked at Maria with a gaze that silenced the room, "is stronger than anyone I've ever met. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve to stand in her presence." Gasps rippled across the room. Maria's cheeks flushed, not with shame this time, but with something fiercer, pride. For the first time, she saw him not just as a man of wealth, but as a man who would use that wealth, that influence, to shield her from the cruelty of a world that had tried to make her small. Later that night, back in the quiet of her home, Maria turned to him. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said softly, "I did, because you and Sophie are my world now, and I'll never let anyone take that from you." The paper crown sat on the table between them, patched and fragile, but shining as though it were made of gold. And for Daniel Mercer, it was. Autumn arrived, and with it came a shift neither Maria nor Daniel could deny. Sophie had started introducing Daniel at school as "my best friend," and sometimes, when she felt especially bold, "my king." The crown, still patched with tape, had become more than a toy. It was a symbol everyone in town recognized now. Teachers smiled when Sophie wore it, and even the children who once mocked her now followed her lead, their own crowns perched proudly on their heads. What had started as ridicule had become a quiet revolution. Daniel found himself more deeply entangled in their lives than he ever imagined. He helped Maria with grocery runs, sat with Sophie during homework, and even learned how to braid her hair after a disastrous but earnest attempt one morning. He wasn't perfect. His braids were lopsided, and his cooking was a catastrophe. But Maria saw the effort in every gesture. Each time, her heart softened a little more. But the life they were building together was not without obstacles. One crisp October evening, Maria returned home from the diner to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a notice. Her landlord intended to sell the building, and tenants had 60 days to vacate. Panic rushed through her veins. Rent had always been a struggle, but moving, finding another affordable place, it felt impossible. She tried to hide it from Daniel, folding the paper into her apron, but he noticed the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she brewed coffee. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Maria," he pressed, his voice gentle but firm. She finally handed him the notice, shame burning in her chest. He read it, jaw tightening. "You were going to keep this from me?" "I didn't want to make you feel responsible," she whispered. "This is my burden. not yours." Daniel set the paper down and took her hand. "Your burdens are mine now, both of yours. Don't you see that?" Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. She had carried everything alone for so long that letting someone else step in felt unnatural, almost dangerous. But Daniel wasn't offering charity. He was offering partnership. Within days, he had found a solution. Not a penthouse in the city, not a mansion behind iron gates, but a modest house in town with a big backyard where Sophie could run and a porch where Maria could drink her morning coffee. He didn't announce it with grand gestures. He simply handed Maria a key one evening and said, "It's ours, if you'll let it be." Maria stood frozen, the weight of the key heavy in her palm. Sophie tugged at her sleeve, crown tilted on her head, her eyes wide with hope. "Mama, does this mean we have a castle?" Maria's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. "Yes, baby, it does." And when she looked up at Daniel, his gaze steady, she realized that he hadn't just given them a house. He had given them something far rarer. He had given them home. The house quickly filled with life. Sophie claimed every corner as her kingdom, decorating the living room with her drawings, planting dandelions in the backyard because every castle needs flowers. Daniel, who had once walked through silent marble halls in his penthouse, found himself laughing as he carried boxes of toys and second-hand furniture through the door. He had never known that happiness could be this simple. Freshly baked bread cooling on the counter, the sound of Sophie's feet running down the hallway, Maria humming softly as she folded laundry. At first, Maria resisted the comfort of it. She worried it was all too much, too fast, that one morning she would wake to find it gone. She still worked long shifts at the diner, still clung to her independence like armor, but slowly she realized that what Daniel offered wasn't a replacement for her strength. It was a place to rest it. When her legs ached, he rubbed her feet without being asked. When her paycheck barely covered expenses, he never waved money in her face. Instead, he simply stocked the fridge and let her pretend it was her doing. Sophie thrived in the new home. Her paper crown sat proudly on the mantelpiece when she wasn't wearing it, and she began inviting friends over to the castle. Daniel watched her with quiet awe, remembering his own childhood with its peeling paint and empty cupboards. Each time he saw her smile, something inside him healed. One chilly evening, as leaves scattered across the yard, Maria stood on the porch wrapped in a blanket. Daniel joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "You've changed everything," she whispered, eyes fixed on the horizon. He shook his head. "No. You and Sophie changed me. I built an empire and thought that was life. But this—" he gestured toward the house, toward the faint sound of Sophie's laughter inside. "This is living." Maria turned to him, her eyes searching. "And what if it all falls apart?" "Then we rebuild," he said simply. For the first time, Maria leaned fully into him, resting her head against his chest. And for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a forever that wasn't built on contracts and skyscrapers, but on love, laughter, and a little girl's paper crown. Winter came early that year, dusting the little house with snow that made it look almost storybook. Sophie pressed her face to the frosted windows, crown perched on her head, squealing each morning at the magic of the white world outside. Daniel taught her how to build snowmen in the backyard, his expensive gloves clumsy as he rolled lopsided spheres of snow. Maria stood at the porch watching them, her heart full in a way she hadn't believed was possible. But even as warmth grew inside their home, the outside world wasn't done testing them. Word had spread beyond the town about Daniel Mercer, the billionaire who had seemingly abandoned boardrooms for a waitress and her daughter. Gossip columns picked it up, headlines flashing his name alongside photos taken without permission. One morning, Maria opened the diner only to find a glossy magazine on the counter with her picture on it, captioned with cruel speculation about why a man like Daniel would choose her. Her face burned, shame and fury tightening her throat. That evening, she confronted him. "I can't live like this," she whispered, holding the magazine with trembling hands. "They'll tear us apart. They'll tear Sophie apart. She's just a child. She doesn't deserve to grow up under this kind of spotlight." Daniel listened silently, then took the magazine from her hands and tore it clean in half. His voice was calm but steady. "Let them write what they want. They don't get to define us. They don't get to define her." He stepped closer, his eyes unyielding. "Maria, the world has always watched me. I can't change that. But I can choose what they see, and I want them to see this family. I want them to see you." Tears welled in her eyes. "And if it gets worse?" "Then I'll stand taller," he said, "because a paper crown is stronger than their gold." When Sophie padded into the room, rubbing her sleepy eyes, she found her mother wrapped in Daniel's arms. She smiled drowsily, adjusting her crown, and whispered, "See? I told you he's our king." Maria pressed her forehead against Daniel's chest, the last of her fear breaking under the weight of his resolve. For years she had carried everything alone, but now, finally, she let herself believe that she didn't have to anymore. Daniel Mercer, the man who once bowed to a little girl with a paper crown, had given her and her mother something far greater than riches. He had given them a love strong enough to weather anything. The storm broke one evening in December. The diner was packed with holiday crowds, locals wrapped in scarves, the scent of coffee and pie thick in the air. Maria moved briskly between tables when a man in a sharp gray suit entered. He wasn't from town. His polished shoes and clipped voice made that clear. He introduced himself as a journalist from a major paper and asked loudly if Maria Ray was working. Heads turned. Maria froze, tray in hand. When she approached, he didn't lower his voice. "Miss Ray, would you care to comment on your relationship with Daniel Mercer? People are saying you're taking advantage of him, that you're just a waitress who got lucky." His words cut the air like knives. A murmur ran through the diner. Maria's cheeks flushed hot, her hands trembling. Before she could respond, the door opened again and Daniel walked in, snow clinging to his coat. He took in the scene in an instant, the reporter, Maria's stricken face, the silence pressing down on the room. Daniel didn't hesitate. He strode forward, his presence commanding every eye, and placed himself firmly at Maria's side. "If you want a comment," he said, his voice cool and steady, "you'll get it from me." The reporter smirked, flipping open his notepad. "Then tell me, Mr. Mercer, why here? Why her? You could have anyone?" Daniel's answer was clear, unwavering. "Because in a world full of people chasing power and status, she is the only one who doesn't want anything from me. She works harder than anyone I've ever met. She raised a daughter with more courage than most men in boardrooms. She reminds me every day what's worth fighting for. That's why her. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you've forgotten what it means to value something real." The diner erupted in quiet applause. Maria stood stunned, tears burning her eyes, as the reporter faltered, realizing there was no story here, only truth. He mumbled a half-hearted thanks and hurried out, leaving the bell above the door jingling in his wake. Daniel turned to Maria then, his expression softening. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone," he said gently. "Not anymore." For the rest of the night, the whispers in the diner weren't sharp with judgment. They were filled with admiration. Maria had been humiliated in front of her town, but Daniel had turned it into something else, into respect. And as Sophie climbed onto his lap later that night, crown perched proudly on her head, Maria realized that this was more than survival. This was the beginning of a life where she was no longer invisible, where her daughter no longer had to shrink under laughter. It was the life she never dared to dream of. Christmas came with a kind of magic Maria hadn't felt since she was a child herself. For the first time in years, their tree wasn't just a thin artificial one pulled from a box in the attic, but a tall pine Daniel and Sophie had picked out together. They decorated it with paper ornaments Sophie cut out by hand, strands of popcorn Daniel had clumsily strung while laughing at his own uneven handiwork, and at the very top, taped carefully in place, sat Sophie's crown. It was bent, patched, worn thin from months of wear, but Daniel insisted it belonged at the highest point. On Christmas morning, Sophie woke them both before dawn, squealing with excitement as she darted through the living room in her pajamas. There were more gifts under the tree than Maria had ever imagined: dolls, books, paints, even a telescope. Daniel had gone overboard, but what stunned Maria most was that none of it felt extravagant. Every gift had been chosen with thought, with love, as though he'd listened to every passing word Sophie had spoken all year. Maria unwrapped a small box last. Inside wasn't jewelry or something costly. It was a pen, a sleek, elegant pen engraved with her initials. She looked up at him, confused. Daniel's voice was quiet. "Because I know you've always wanted to write. Your stories, your thoughts, your life. You've given everything to everyone else. Maybe it's time you give something back to yourself." Her throat closed, tears spilling over before she could stop them. No one had ever seen her so clearly. She threw her arms around him, holding on longer than she meant to. Sophie clapped her hands. "Mama, you're crying happy tears." That night, after Sophie fell asleep surrounded by her new treasures, Maria and Daniel sat by the fire. She looked at him with the glow of the flames dancing across his face and whispered, "You've given us more than I can ever repay." Daniel shook his head. "Maria, you and Sophie gave me a reason to live beyond numbers. Before you, I had everything and nothing at the same time. Now I have home." The silence stretched, warm and full. Maria reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. For years she had lived in fear of being left behind, but for the first time she let herself believe in forever. Outside, snow fell softly over the house. Inside, by the fire, a billionaire who had once bowed to a little girl with a paper crown finally understood what it meant to kneel to something greater than wealth. He had found love, family, and the kind of peace no fortune could ever buy. The new year arrived quietly in their little house, without the glittering parties Daniel once attended, without the endless toasts of champagne and polished speeches. Instead, it came with Sophie banging 2 wooden spoons together in the living room, shouting, "Happy New Year," as her crown slid crookedly over one eye. Maria laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks, and Daniel, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside them, realized he wouldn't trade this chaos for all the ballrooms in the world. January brought new routines. Sophie started a reading challenge at school, and Daniel surprised her by volunteering as a guest reader once a week. The children stared wide-eyed as the famous CEO squeezed into a too-small chair, paper crown perched on his head, because Sophie insisted he wear it while reading. He didn't care about the whispers or the photos some parents snapped. He only cared about the way Sophie glowed with pride. Maria, too, began to change. For so long, she had carried her life like a weight, her head bowed under responsibilities that seemed endless. But with Daniel at her side, she started lifting it higher. She still worked at the diner, still poured coffee and wiped counters, but now she did it without shame. Because when people whispered, she knew they were also remembering the night Daniel had stood for her, the nights he still came to sit quietly at her booth, like she was the most important part of his world. One evening after closing, Maria found Daniel waiting outside with his coat collar turned up against the cold. "You don't have to pick me up," she teased softly. "I've been walking home from here for years." He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe, but queens shouldn't have to walk alone in the dark." Her breath caught, her heart thudding in her chest. No one had ever spoken to her that way, not with pity, not with hollow flattery, but with reverence, as though he truly believed she was something rare. When they got home, Sophie was already asleep, crown resting on her nightstand. Maria lingered in the kitchen with Daniel, the quiet between them charged with something unspoken. At last she whispered, "Why us, Daniel? Out of everyone, why us?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because you don't see the billionaire. You don't want what I have. You see me. And Sophie. Sophie saw me before I even saw myself again." Maria pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she had finally landed. And Daniel Mercer, the man who once measured his life in boardroom victories, knew with certainty that his greatest triumph was here, in a little house with a woman who carried quiet strength and a little girl who wore a crown made of paper. By February, the rhythm of their lives had settled into something so natural that even Daniel's board began to notice the change. He wasn't always in the office before dawn anymore. Sometimes he arrived later, still carrying the faint scent of Maria's coffee or with a crayon smudge on his cuff where Sophie had hugged him goodbye. Some directors whispered their concern, but Daniel silenced them with results. His focus hadn't dimmed. It had sharpened. For the first time in years, he led not out of hunger or fear, but out of clarity. He had something worth protecting now, something worth working for beyond himself. At home, the bond between him and Sophie grew unshakable. She declared that every Sunday was Castle Day, which meant pancakes, paper crowns, and time together. Daniel tried his hand at cooking, nearly burning the first batch, but Sophie ate them anyway, giggling with syrup on her cheeks. "Best pancakes ever," she announced, and Daniel laughed harder than he had in years. Maria watched them both, her heart swelling with gratitude and fear all at once. Gratitude for what they had found, fear that it was too fragile, that the world would try to take it away. One evening, that fear came to life in an unexpected way. Maria's ex-husband, a man who had disappeared years before leaving only debts and broken promises, showed up at the diner. He swaggered in with the smell of whiskey on his breath, sneering when he spotted her. "So it's true," he drawled. "You caught yourself a rich one. Figures. Couldn't make it on your own forever." His voice was loud enough that the whole diner heard. Maria's hands shook as she set down a tray, her past crashing into her present like a storm. Before she could respond, the door opened and Daniel walked in. The room seemed to still at the sight of him. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask. He crossed the diner in steady strides until he stood between Maria and the man who had once broken her. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "You don't belong here. Not in this diner, not in her life, and certainly not in Sophie's." The ex-husband laughed harshly. "And who are you to say?" Daniel's answer was quiet, yet it carried the weight of truth. "I'm the man who stayed when you left. I'm the one who bows to your daughter's crown because she deserves a world that never belittles her again, and I'll make sure she has it." The diner erupted in murmurs. The ex-husband's bravado faltered under the unwavering force of Daniel's gaze. He muttered something under his breath and stumbled out into the night, leaving the bell above the door ringing in his wake. Maria stood frozen, tears stinging her eyes. Daniel turned to her, his expression softening instantly. "He can't hurt you anymore," he whispered. For the first time in years, Maria believed it. Sophie would never know the kind of abandonment she had endured. Because Daniel wasn't just filling a role, he was rewriting what family meant. And Maria realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to build a future with him, crown and all. Spring thawed the last of winter's snow, and with it came new beginnings Maria hadn't dared to dream of. The little house Daniel had given them began to bloom with life. Maria planted flowers along the porch, Sophie claimed a corner of the yard as a royal garden, and Daniel spent weekends clumsily hammering together a wooden swing set that leaned slightly to the left but made Sophie laugh. until her sides hurt. The town watched it all unfold with fascination. Where once there had been whispers of judgment, now there were nods of respect. People began to see Daniel not as a billionaire swooping in to play hero, but as a man who had chosen to belong, who showed up again and again without needing applause. They saw Maria not as a waitress who'd been lucky, but as the woman who had held her head high through every storm, whose quiet strength had drawn even a man like Daniel Mercer into her orbit. Yet Maria still carried a seed of doubt. One evening, as she folded laundry at the kitchen table, she asked softly, "Do you ever miss it? The parties, the travel, the attention?" Daniel looked up from the floor where he was helping Sophie piece together a puzzle. "Not for a second," he said simply. "I had all of that, and it left me empty. This is the first time I've felt full." He set the puzzle piece down and reached across the table for her hand. "Maria, you and Sophie aren't my distraction from life. You are my life." Her breath caught, her throat tightening with emotions she could no longer hold back. She squeezed his hand, blinking back tears, and whispered, "Then stay. Stay for good." Daniel's answer was wordless at first. He rose, crossed the small kitchen, and pulled her into his arms. His embrace was steady, grounding, and when he finally spoke, his voice was certain, forever. From the doorway, Sophie's small voice piped up, crown tilted over one eye. "Does that mean you're our king now?" Daniel laughed, scooping her up into his arms. "If the queen allows it," he teased, glancing at Maria. Maria smiled through her tears, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to guard her heart. She nodded once. "I think she does." And just like that, a family was sealed, not with contracts or signatures, but with promises written in love, promises stronger than any empire Daniel had ever built.